The Committee on Science, Space, and Technology will come to order, and I say good morning and welcome to today's hearing entitled Recent Developments in NASA's Commercial Crew Acquisition Strategy. And in front of your packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witnesses. And we certainly thank all of you for your preparation time, your traveling time, and for the time you're giving us here today. We'll have opening statements, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. But before we begin today, I want to take a moment to pay tribute to a true hero, and I know it's a tribute all of us would pay, and a very dear friend, Neil Armstrong, who was memorialized yesterday in a very moving ceremony at the National Cathedral. And he's been before this committee a lot of times, and he was an inspiration to everyone, hero throughout the world, and yet one of the most humble and gracious men you've ever known or ever met. I had the pleasure of having him in my home in late August, and have the thing I've treasured more than anything, his letter back just several days later that I didn't really receive, though it didn't find its way through Washington, through Texas to my office in Rockwall, my home in Rockwall, for some time. But several occasions he appeared before this committee. His first step, I don't say anything here that you don't know, and if you were listening, you heard it yesterday, a lot of it. Established our preeminence in space, and I think it got old to them to hear people introduce them as the Columbuses and the Magellans of space, but that's exactly what they were. And Neil was just really an advocate for preserving our leadership, and he never expected. I know my colleagues join me in working to carry out his legacy, and will always be inspired by his very remarkable life and forever honor him for his place in American history. He certainly has a place. People will be reading about him and value very much the pictures they have with him, though they didn't get an autograph with most of them in his latter years. I think he got a little sick of people getting his autograph and going selling it for $1,000 or so. I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. I know you've treasured his recognition yesterday and the memory that we had of him. I'll get underway with my statement. NASA recently awarded more than $1.1 billion to 3 companies to develop competing concepts for human space transportation launch systems, and today's hearing is going to review NASA's rationale for selecting the 3 companies to consider the cost and safety implications of these recent decisions, and given the unique nature of Space Act agreements, examine the level of NASA's insight and thus its ability to evaluate technical and safety requirements. Our nation has made great strides in space exploration, but these strides have not come without cost and without sacrifice. We've lost astronauts. After the Columbia accident, President Bush and Congress put through our nation and absolutely put us on a path to develop new human space transportation systems that were designed from inception to be safer than the space shuttle. Safety was very big, of course. NASA responded with the Constellation system, but this administration has chosen a different path. NASA now seeks to use the government funds to stimulate aerospace companies to develop multiple competing human spaceflight systems for which NASA may be the only customer. Are these systems designed from inception to be safer than the space shuttle, or is NASA responding to different goals? How and when will we know the safety of these new systems? NASA is using Space Act agreements, not regular contracts, giving the companies great flexibility to do as they see fit. In fact, so much flexibility that during this phase, no NASA crew transportation system requirements can be levied. It's hard for me to understand why NASA is proceeding this way. Will this result in systems that are safe for our American and international partner astronauts? How will NASA know if they don't have the insight? And perhaps more importantly to those of us in Congress who are asked to fund this, how and when will NASA know if it's getting what it needs and if these systems will be safe enough? Redesigns will be costly and time-consuming if important technical or safety requirements are not addressed up front, which I think they should be. If our nation's going to ask crews to explore space, it's our responsibility to do everything possible to ensure that those astronauts return to Earth safely. I'm not convinced this approach is the right one, but I'm willing to listen. And at this time, recognize Ms. Edwards for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your words about Neil Armstrong. It really was quite a moving tribute and celebration of his life yesterday, and I think for those of us, whether we were mature back then or we were just the little girls in school, it made us come to appreciate the, just sort of desire and willingness to explore uncharted territory, and I think has made me, anyway, as infectious about NASA and the space program as I've ever been. I want to thank our witnesses this morning and look forward to your testimony. And as my colleagues know, I'm a strong supporter of NASA, both the science programs and the human spaceflight activities. I'm also keenly interested in and excited by the entrepreneurial energy that's being devoted to human spaceflight these days. The passion of those working on commercial approaches to human spaceflight is indeed infectious, and as I said before, no great secret. I want to be there myself. I want to fly. But that said, in my capacity here as a member of this committee, I have a responsibility, as we all do, to scrutinize each of NASA's major projects to make sure they're well planned and executable. NASA's commercial crew program has to be subjected to that same level of oversight and scrutiny if we're to do our jobs on this committee. In that regard, I am concerned that NASA may not be holding that program, the commercial program, to the same standard as other major acquisitions. And I think we should make no mistake, this is a major acquisition for NASA. When the taxpayer is footing the bill, paying on average 9 out of every $10 that's being spent to develop these commercial crew vehicles, we're not talking about a straightforward purchase of commercial services from a GSA list. These services don't even exist yet. I'm puzzled and a little bit frustrated that NASA appears to be unable or unwilling to acknowledge the warning signs that this major program is not on a firm path to success at present, and look forward to hearing from our witnesses about that. In that regard, the written testimony of the chair of the Aerospace Advisory Panel, ASAP, Admiral Dyer, is illuminating. While his prose is cautious and understated, it's hard not to read the concern couched in such statements as, and I quote, "Lacking an independent cost estimate, we are uncertain as to affordability." And continuing the quote, "However, we arrive at this point in time with designs that are maturing before requirements and where government and industry have not yet agreed on how winning designs will be accepted and certified. We worry that the cart is ahead of the horse." And he continued, "NASA is just now undertaking to determine how systems will be certified to transport NASA astronauts. This timing increases programmatic risk and serious potential to impact safety." And so to that, I'd add some of my own concerns, namely that not only do we not have an independent cost assessment to guide our congressional deliberations, we don't even have independent assessment of when these commercial systems will actually be able to start operational services to the International Space Station. NASA is saying in the 2017 timeframe, and in Mr. Gerstenmaier's testimony, and even 2018 in one of its notional planning charts, and I would note that both these dates are within just a few years of the currently scheduled end of space station operations, and years later than originally promised. Moreover, both of those dates appear to be based on assumed funding levels for the commercial crew program that don't even seem to bear much resemblance to what Congress has authorized or appropriated so far, or is likely to approve in the foreseeable future. If that's true, then I think we need NASA to give us a cost and schedule estimate that's based on more realistic budgetary assumptions so we can see what is most likely to actually happen, something we require for all other NASA major programs. In addition, NASA still has not given Congress a clear understanding of how much it will cost to fly our astronauts on these commercial systems, and it's reported that NASA has had an independent assessment that estimate that NASA's commercial crew seats are likely to be several times as high as Soyuz costs. If that's true, and I want to know whether it's true, we need to know. And finally, as alluded to in Admiral Dyer's testimony, NASA's latest approach to acquiring those commercial crew systems is, to put it charitably, complex and unique. Trying to run Space Act agreements in parallel to FAR FAR-based contracts may be a workaround, and as the ASAP testimony phrases it, but that begs the question of why NASA didn't just stick to its original plan for FAR-based contracting. So we have a lot to talk about today, and as I close, I would like to say how much I appreciate the service that's rendered to this committee and to the nation on a continuing basis by the gentleman appearing before us today, and you both have really difficult jobs, and we appreciate your efforts, and thank you very much.
All right, gentlelady yields back. And if there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this time, I'm honored to get to introduce the panel of witnesses. Our first witness is Mr. William H. Gerstenmaier, a very capable Associate Administrator of Human Exploration and Operations Mission Directorate at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Mr. Gerstenmaier began his career at NASA in 1977 after graduating from Purdue University with a Bachelor of Science degree in Aeronautical Engineering. He's been before this committee on many occasions. We've sought his advice. He's always been generous with it. During his tenure at NASA, he's led a number of activities associated with the Shuttle International Space Station and the Shuttle Mir. Mr. Gerstenmaier has received a number of awards at NASA, including the Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Executives. And I welcome you once again, Mr. Gerstenmaier. Our second witness is retired U.S. Navy Vice Admiral Joseph W. Dyer, Chairman of the Airspace Safety Advisory Panel. Admiral Dyer served a long and distinguished career in the United States Navy. He received his wings in 1971, progressed through the ranks, eventually attaining the position of Chief Test Pilot, then as Program Manager for the F-18 program. And from 2000 to 2003 served as Commander of the Naval Air Systems Command. Today he's a Senior Executive with the iRobot Corporation. Welcome, Admiral Dyer. We're very delighted to have you with us here today. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. We'd be generous with that, with the value of your presentation here and your gift of your time, getting ready, coming here and testifying. I now recognize as a witness to present their testimony. Mr. Gerstenmaier, you're recognized for 5 minutes, sir, to present your testimony.
Okay, thank you. I have the privilege of working with the teams that are developing and operating the systems that support human spaceflight. The teams take this responsibility very seriously. This is a tremendous responsibility and honor. These teams are doing their best to deliver and operate systems in efficient, effective, safe, and cost-effective manners. The teams also recognize the sacrifices made by this nation to provide NASA the funds necessary to pursue these endeavors. The teams believe the sacrifices made by the nation will enable a better future. Sometimes folks like to talk about our development activities, commercial and traditional, as separate, unrelated activities. There have been 2 hearings this week, one on examining NASA's development of the Space Launch System and Orion crew capsule, and today's hearing, recent developments in NASA's commercial crew acquisition strategy. I look at these as related activities and both in support of human spaceflight. The commercial crew program is important to the International Space Station program. We need redundant crew transportation and rescue capability as soon as possible. We need to back up crew transportation for this remarkable facility, the International Space Station. We have dissimilar redundancy in cargo. We have different providers for cargo, and we need the same for crew. We need a very different system to enable exploration beyond low Earth orbit. That is for SLS and Orion. It has different technical capabilities. The current budget environment is making developing 2 systems, crew for ISS and the SLS Orion for beyond low Earth orbit, a challenge. Both of these programs are needed for a human spaceflight program. We need to look at these programs supporting each other and ultimately the human spaceflight program for the nation. The human spaceflight program, in combination with NASA's Scientific Robotic Exploration Program, is providing a motivation for innovation, creativity, and provides the nation a chance to inspire students to pursue technical careers. My written testimony covers many of the recent events in Commercial Crew program. We recently have made the Commercial Crew Integrated Capability Space Act Awards. The teams have completed requirements development for crew transportation. We have developed an overall strategy that uses space acts and contracts. This strategy is outlined in a white paper that is publicly available. 2 days ago, we put out a request for proposal for the first phase of the contract that will develop crew transportation for ISS. The intent is this award of the first phase of this is the first award of the first phase of a two-phase contract that we intend to award in February of 2013. We are still finalizing the details of our overall strategy in the out years. And then we also put out a white paper that describes our approach to certifying designs for crew transportation. And this white paper is not to be confused with the white paper on acquisition strategy. This white paper talks about how we're going to actually certify the designs and how we maintain waivers, et cetera, and ensure the safety of the requirements that are in place. And we're looking for comments to this white paper that was recently released. You know, we've listened to many outside expert advisors and built a sound strategy to deliver a capability for this nation in a cost-effective and safe manner. The approach to this program is different than past programs, but shares many similarities. We have learned from previous activities and are putting that learning to work. We are also taking lessons from the Commercial Crew and applying those back to SLS and Orion. I'm sure we will learn more as we progress. We are innovating as best that we can. It will not be easy developing a system to safely carry crew to the ISS. The teams have made tremendous progress in the last year. We still have many challenges ahead, understanding the fiscal year 13 budget, completing Phase 1 awards for the certification acquisition, monitoring progress of our commercial providers as they head towards a critical design review level of maturity, and refining the out-year acquisition strategy. We will listen to the outside advisors and take their advice into consideration. I continue to watch the NASA team deliver programs and products that others thought impossible. With proper support from all of us, the NASA team will deliver a safe U.S. crew transportation system for the ISS. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
And we thank you. I recognize Admiral Dyer to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Hall. Distinguished members of the panel, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. As requested, I will present the ASAP's perspective regarding NASA's current acquisition approach for the commercial transportation system. As noted in our 2011 annual report, the Commercial Crew program remains an important topic for the ASAP. We have closely followed the program, its progress, and its acquisition strategy. Sir, my outline for remarks today are how high should the bar be set with regard to safety, the certification contracts, a big step forward, but how will they be administered, this relationship between the SAA and FAR contracts that Congressman Edwards addressed, and lastly, clear communications. Congressman Hall, when I went through this with my wife last night, it took me 7 minutes. She said that wasn't too bad for a Southerner. I told her you'd understand. In our 2011 report, we addressed the question, and I quote, "How safe is safe enough? The pursuit of great reward often comes hand in hand with great risk. So it has always been with explorers. The answer to the question must come from a balance between risk and reward and should reflect a consensus among the American people, the White House, and the Congress. It is not our purpose or intent to answer the question, how safe is safe enough? It is instead to point out areas where we believe the stated requirement may not produce the requisite safety." Mr. Gerstenmaier and his team produced a retrospective review of the Space Shuttle safety program and risk with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight. During those Genesis days, there was a belief that the risk of loss to crew was 1 in 1,000. Retrospectively, we believe now that it is 1 in 12. The design goal or design baseline for commercial space is 1 in 270 for a specific mission. So we raise the question, are we raising the bar high enough? That remains to be seen, but I know it's very much on the mind of NASA. In our submission, sir, we provide a checklist of what we believe are 6 most important items, and as our practice, we have color-coded them, red, yellow, green, to reflect what we believe to be their status. A solid green and a giant step forward is that NASA has clearly communicated to the partners come contractors that certification is a fundamental requirement of transitioning NASA and transporting astronauts to and from space. 3 elements that we code as yellow, they're progressing, they're advanced significantly by the certification contracts, but not yet in hand, are establishing solid requirements, promulgating how the agency will verify those requirements, and a validation and verification plan. 2 elements that are red in our mind deal primarily with the process that contractors shall follow on the path to certification. Congressman Edwards, as you indicated, it's not yet clear to us how waivers and deviations will be approved, who is accountable, and how the process shall be administered. Lastly, both from the Congress's perspective and NASA's perspective, budget and budget stability are a significant challenge. Mr. Chairman, informally, the committee staff has asked, is the Space Act agreement appropriate to support the development of commercial true transportation capabilities? To date, many maintain that the freedom and flexibility of an SAA have enabled creativity and innovation, and it may be delivering greater value for money. That may be true. However, we arrive at this point in time with the designs that are maturing before requirements, where government and industry have not yet agreed on how winning designs will be accepted and certified. The current acquisition approach, when funded under the SAA construct, is concurrent with a contracted or FAR-based certification program. It is unique and it is complex. In our opinion, this approach is a workaround for the requirements and the communication and challenges implicit in the SAA. It is not clear yet to the panel how the safety requirements necessary for certification will flow from the FAR contract to the SAA partners. Let me speak specifically to communication, and I would submit this is my most important message of the morning. In our travels to Boeing, SpaceX, Orbital Sciences, Sierra Nevada, and Blue Origin, we've heard pros and cons with regard to the SAA. Flexibility is universally the prime advantage. However, as the design matures and begins taking shape, partners seek reassurance that they are on the right track that will lead to successful certification. They pose specific questions about what NASA will eventually require of the designs. But NASA interprets that they cannot provide the answers to these SAA questions, questions under the SAA construct. We ask the partners, so in that case, what do you do? One contractor answered by saying, we look for nonverbal communication. You know, body language and winks and nods. Mr. Chairman, if you're the congressionally chartered panel tasked to watch over safety, this is not a comfortable communication approach for requirements. The FAR-based certification contract has the potential to overcome this challenge, but is a workaround for the downsides of Space Act agreements. Thank you, sir.
Admiral, thank you. And that was a very good presentation. You kind of shook your finger in her face there once. Did you do that to your wife?
She usually does it to me. So.
Okay. Good testimony, and we thank you for it. Don't judge the interest of this committee by empty chairs here, because November 7th or 6th is coming pretty soon, and we have just a few working days. Each of them have somewhere to go. I'm not unlike each of them, because I have to leave the chair to go to the floor for a while now, and I'm going to ask the chairman of Space and Aeronautics, a gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Palazzo, to take the chair until I get back, and not to get used to it or don't enjoy it too much.
I want to echo the Chairman Hall's comments and thank you again for your solid testimony. I'd also like to remind members of the committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will at this point open the round of questions. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Many of us on this committee lived through the Admiral Dyer, this is going to be directed to you. Many of us on this committee lived through the aftermath of the Columbia accident investigation and remember some of those lessons. NASA needs clear requirements and good communications with its companies. Your testimony points out how NASA's planned approach, where development is funded by SAA concurrent and with certification funded by a FAR-based contract, is complex, unique, and a workaround for the communications and requirements that are necessary to ensure safety in NASA's final certification. If your panel is not comfortable with this approach, then Congress should not be comfortable either. What is the worst case scenario from this process, and what keeps the ASAP up at night?
Well, sir, there are a number of things that keep us up at night. Let me address two uber ones, and then I'll home in a little closer. The first worry is, frankly, that another administration takes another approach to space program, as we've seen over the last several administrations in our country. If that happens, it's going to be a long way to Mars. Closer to home, this issue of clarity and focus is important, we believe, from the ASAP perspective. There are different leadership perspectives within NASA, and frankly, there's some lack of clarity that makes the program harder to manage. That, along with the cost estimate that Congressman Edwards mentions. The agency knows how to build space systems. The agency knows how to support economic development, but the concurrency and some uncertainty as to which is prime is making the program harder to manage. Likewise, the budget lack of a cost estimate on behalf of NASA and the uncertainty and instability as funding finds its way to NASA are probably the largest worries. To get to the bottom line, perhaps, of the question you're asking, were NASA to run short of funds and in an attempt to deliver with lesser funds, if they were to continue with the Space Act agreement and put aside the FAR-based contracts, we think that would not lead to a good place.
Admiral Dyer, proponents of NASA's commercial crew acquisition approach often tout the monetary contributions of the companies as an example of efficiency in government contracting. The implication being that the companies should have some skin in the game. Yet, as a business leader, I'm sure you understand that companies only lay out money if they believe they can get it back, plus an adequate return on their investment. Would you comment on how the life cycle costs of NASA's current approach could lead to higher seat prices to the government than if standard contracting had been used in the beginning?
Well, I am an engineer like my friend Bill Gerstenmaier, so let me use the technique of let's look at it in the limits and then decide where we are somewhere in between. On one end of the continuum, if a company pays the total bill in and of themselves, then they should have total freedom and the marketplace should determine the utility. But the buyer in this relationship has only an indirect influence on what the company designs and delivers, if they're doing it all themselves. Over on the other end of the continuum, in a more classic fully government-funded undertaking, the government has great influence as the buyer. They can specify what they want and what the system should deliver. We're on neither one of those continuums. We're somewhere in the middle with a significant amount of money being paid by the government, a smaller amount of money being skin in the game, as you call it. But the influence in some people's minds is the inversion of that. Even though there's a small amount of contractor money in the game, there is tremendous influence via an SAA. So let's just, for argument's sake, say that we are totally in the middle and everybody's paying 50-50. Does that represent a good life cycle cost equation? Well, it does if it succeeds, but it doesn't if it fails.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I would say that I think the advantage here to the contractors is they see a market out there for these vehicles and this capability beyond NASA's needs. So they look at what they're doing with their rocket development, and it can be used for other applications, and it can fly in other areas separate than NASA. So they have a market beyond us. So they're willing to put some development funding into this activity so they can support that other activity when it comes about with their capability they're developing, and that will essentially lower the cost for us in development. So what we're doing is we're essentially allowing them to take the work that they're doing, the development they're working on for the launcher, for example. In the case of SpaceX, that launcher can be used to launch satellites in another market separate from NASA. That helps them expend or receive revenue in those other areas. So that's the reason that they're contributing. Boeing looks at it. They see another market out there for commercial crew flights to space, and so does Sierra Nevada as well. So they see another market out there, so they're building this capability not only for NASA but for their own use, so therefore it's appropriate for them to contribute some portion of the developmental costs to this activity.
Thank you. I now recognize Ms. Edwards for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. I don't know if others heard it, but I have to tell you, Admiral Dyer, I hear like real warning signs coming out of your testimony, and particularly when you talk about proceeding with designs before you have requirements. I just don't get that. Mr. Gerstenmaier, does the schedule that you've outlined in your acquisition strategy assume that you'll receive the President's budget request level of $830 million per year for the remainder of the development program?
Based on our PBE submit in 2013, it does from 2014 on. We expect to receive that level of funding.
So since that level of funding, I don't know, do you think that level of funding really appears likely in the current fiscal environment? And what would be the impact on your schedule if you get an annual funding level of $500 million per year?
Again, where we are for 13 is we're uncertain about the funding level in 13 because we're sitting here with a continuing resolution, so we're held back basically at the funding level of 12. We've accommodated for that funding scenario in 13 here, where we've been hoping in 13 we would get somewhere around the Senate level that's been discussed in some of the bills. We'll see what we get. Then from 14 on out, we're looking at getting in the 800 level of funding, and as part of the PBE 14, we'll provide you the details of the cost estimate, the details of the budgeting that go behind that, and in an effort to try to get support for this program that we think is critically important and we need on the order of the $800 million per year in 14.
I strongly suggest that, especially in this environment here, to pen an estimate of, completion and activity based on a hope is a real challenge, I think, for the agency. Admiral Dyer, does NASA's commercial crew budget seem sufficient to you, and what are your considerations as you answer that question?
NASA, of course, supports the President's budget, but I will tell you from close and long-term association with the folks at NASA, they feel they're underfunded. They feel they're challenged to deliver what they're asked to accomplish with funding available. They're being innovative, and that's good. But I recommended, Mr. Chairman, in my first appearance before this committee some years ago, that if I could give NASA and the Congress a single gift, it would be a good cost estimate.
Can I just ask you then, given that statement, how is it that in the absence of an independent cost and schedule estimate, can we in Congress know with any level of confidence what it will get for whatever budget NASA proposes?
Well, that's a challenge. It is an understanding of what it's going to cost to deliver, number one. Number two, it's a confident place to stand with the best of conscience, because somewhere along the line of fewer dollars, longer time, less money, there must be a place where good conscience says we can't deliver for this. Now, I'll tell you right up front, I have 30 years of association with Charlie Bolton and the very highest respect for Bill Gerstenmaier. These folks will not violate good conscience, but we're making it hard for them.
Thank you. And just as I close, Mr. Gerstenmaier, can you just tell me why you failed to seek an independent cost estimate and schedule for the commercial crew program, and isn't it the norm for all of the other NASA major programs to do such?
We have the basis for our cost estimate, which we've provided to you. It's not a traditional cost estimate. If you look at what we're doing here, we're procuring under a hybrid discussion, as we've talked about, with a Space Act portion and a contract piece. We asked the contractors as part of the Commercial Crew Integration Capabilities Space Act to give us the cost to go all the way to a demonstration flight. We now have that cost data available from those proposals. We're going to take that cost data now and run it through an independent group to take a look at that and develop an independent cost assessment based on that data we received from them, and we'll provide that to you as part of the President's budget request for 2014. So we will give you the data associated with what we've got from the contractors or from the Space Act activities, and we'll provide that to you as an independent assessment as we go forward in 14. And to be frank, that was as fast as we could get it to you with this hybrid approach that we were taking.
Thank you, and I yield.
I now recognize Mr. Smith from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gerstenmaier, you have a wonderful reputation for your technical knowledge and for being a good manager, so I'd like to direct some questions to you. The first one is that I appreciate the funding constraints that have been mentioned, but has the White House sent any signals to you to go slow either on Orion or SLS?
No, we've received no signals to go slow on either Orion or SLS.
Okay. Next question is, when it comes to NASA and the target deadline of 2014 for the first test launch of Orion. What are the odds that NASA will make that 2014 deadline?
We have very solid plans to have the Orion capsule ready to support that 2014 test flight. Our plans now show delivery of that vehicle. It's actually in Florida now, undergoing outfitting in Florida. It should be complete and ready to be turned over to the launch vehicle at the end of next year, in December of 2013. What we're waiting on is the launch vehicle. The current launch vehicle availability is September of 2014. And so pending the launch vehicle, I believe we'll be ready to fly in 2014. But the capsule work is going very well. We're working heat shield problems. We're working some avionics problems. We're working some parts problems. That's all normal stuff we do normally. We've got schedule margin. We will have the vehicle ready to go fly at the end of 2013. All we need is a launch vehicle.
100% sure?
I'm never 100% sure.
Close.
But we will be ready before the launch vehicle is ready. That I can tell you.
Great. Another odds question. What are the odds that Boeing and SpaceX and Sierra Nevada will meet their scheduled deadlines?
If you take a look at some of their proposals or you discuss with them, they show earlier crew transportation dates than 2017. They think they can be earlier than those dates. From a NASA perspective, we backed off. We said it wasn't appropriate to accept their dates. We wanted some margin in that. So we have done our planning based on a 2017 delivery date, which gives us some margin.
So you have every expectation they'll meet their deadlines?
I think they'll be a little bit late from what they're advertising in their proposals, but they will be there about the time we estimate in 2017.
Okay, thank you for that. Last question is this. There's been some discussion about the definition of commercial as it is applied to commercial crew and cargo programs. What percentage of the funding for those programs comes from the private sector, and what percentage of the funding comes from NASA?
It varies by each one of the participants in the Space Act, the amount, and it's proprietary to the companies, the exact percentage. But there is a contribution by them. It's smaller in some cases and larger in other cases.
Overall, it's been my understanding that 80 or 90% of the funding comes from NASA. Is that a ballpark, legitimate figure?
I would say yes. The majority of the funding is coming from NASA for this activity.
Okay. Does that raise any questions about applying the term commercial to some of these enterprises, or are you comfortable with that application?
We could have a long discussion about what the term commercial really means. I guess I'm not. The way I look at it is I would not use that term specifically, but what we're doing is we're getting a contribution from the contractors to help in this activity because they believe there's another market out there. If you want to pin the term commercial on that, you can pin the term. But the facts are what I described.
Yeah. And regardless, we appreciate what they're doing and their capability as well. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now recognize Ms. Bonamici from Oregon for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you both for your testimony and for all you do. Admiral Dwyer, I want to follow up on the issue of how the role of the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel is shaped based on the underlying goal of the Commercial Crew Initiative. And I know in the past ASAP has written about the need for clarity and consistency of purpose, and you talked about that in your testimony. So in the ASAP's opinion, is the purpose of the Commercial Crew Program to develop the commercial space industry, or is it to acquire transportation to the International Space Station?
Well, that's a great question, and one that we've asked. And one that's not entirely clear in its answer, at least to us. Is it economic development? Looking back to the 1930s and the role that government played in what became our aviation industry via the airmail programs? Or is it transportation of astronauts to the International Space Station and to low Earth orbit? De facto, I think the answer is both. That NASA is attempting to do both. But part of what we mean by a lack of clarity is an answer to which is the priority and which is first function and first focus. Sometimes I think the administration and leadership of the program is harder because those priorities seem at least to ebb and flow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I wanted to ask Mr. Gerstenmaier, the work that NASA does is very important to everyone in the country, but in the district I represent in Oregon, it's home to a lot of high-tech companies in an area known as the Silicon Forest. And though they may not be directly NASA-related, the technology companies in the district certainly all benefit from the development of new innovative solutions that NASA's been responsible for over the years. So I want to ask about the development of a domestic alternative to the Russian Soyuz spacecraft that's currently being used to transport crew members to the ISS. And apparently you've indicated earlier this year, I believe in Senate testimony, that the domestic alternative is expected to reduce costs. And I understand it may be too early to determine the exact value of that cost reduction and those savings, but will you please discuss what factors you'll be considering in making the eventual determination, and discuss particularly how or whether NASA will consider the intangible benefits that a domestic alternative may have, especially in the area of innovation and economic development. It's a balance, and I wonder if you could suggest how we can use this acquisition policy to simultaneously encourage private sector creativity and innovation, but without diminishing the safety of our astronauts. Thank you.
Okay. You articulated very clearly all the things we're trading back and forth. We clearly have to keep safety as number one in this activity and make sure we have a transportation system that can keep our crews safe. And Admiral Dwyer described pretty clearly what one of the big questions is: how safe is safe enough? And we're going to have to work collectively to determine that. None of us can do that individually, but we will definitely adhere to safety. Innovation is very important. Doing things domestically is also important. To challenge our folks to do things a new way, to look at using commercial products, to look at other ways of getting crew to space has tremendous advantages to us domestically here in the U.S. We also would like to get good value. We've budgeted at roughly the Soyuz seat price in the out years with inflation going forward. We would like to get lower than that, and we'll see where the costs come in as we go through this activity and we get better understanding of where things move. But I think the things you describe are things that we need to trade across each other. The one that I think there becomes a line around is safety. At some point, we don't trade beyond that. We need to make sure we get a capability that will support what we need. Then the next piece comes in, the cost side. If the costs go extremely high, which we don't think they will, we think we have a good chance to get the cost less than Soyuz. But if they go high, then we need to trade. Are we getting significant benefit on the innovation side and the domestic production side to make that warranted? So we'll articulate to you to the best of our ability where we see that information fall out, and then with you we can help make those trades that are right for the nation.
Thank you very much. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I now recognize Mr. Rohrbacher from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to get a feel for what's really going on here. And first let me ask, this hybrid system that you're talking about, obviously this is not a pure commercial system that we're working on. Obviously, we're heading in that direction. Perhaps that's why that term is being used. That system put in place, and it has been utilized this one time for the supply of the space station. How much did that save us, or did that cost us to utilize that new system rather than the traditional ways that NASA has been using to resupply the space station?
In the case of cargo, I can't give you a specific number of what we saved, but if you look at the launch costs and the cargo delivery, it's substantially less by using the Space Act approach and then actually acquiring the services under a FAR Part 12 contract for the actual delivery of the services. So that's been a significant savings to us. The thing that we need to consider with crew is there's another dimension, and that's the safety aspect. And we need to watch that as it goes forward. But there was a significant savings by using this approach with cargo.
Right. Significant savings. And do you identify that there was a significant greater risk at using this hybrid system?
I think that the risk in the case of cargo was schedule. We got the systems delivered to us later than we would have desired, but we were able to extend the shuttle with an extra flight that made that risk tolerable to have that schedule delay acceptable to us overall.
And so there's a lot of concern being expressed today about extending a system that has already worked for cargo and trying to utilize that for crew. And it's already proven very significantly successful in terms of financially without really identifiable risk except in terms of the schedule. And now people are very concerned that we might apply that same hybrid principle to crew. Now, obviously, we are concerned about the lives of the crew. Let me also, so that's just one fundamental that I see going on here in this hearing. And Admiral, you said something in passing that sort of made me think. It's a long way to Mars, basically, unless we have this steady, if we can't count on steady funding. Let me suggest that I think that nobody wants to face the fact that we can't afford to go to Mars now. The bottom line is, in order to have steady funding, we're going to have to defund every other space project that we have. Nobody here wants to face that. Maybe if we're going to provide safety, maybe if we're going to provide reliability and do it the way professionally, maybe we should set our goals to something that we can actually accomplish within the budgets that are possible without destroying every other aspect of the space program. And I think that's what's happening here today. That's what we're really discussing. And I think there's a lot of things that we can do in space. I think that this hybrid system that we're talking about now will give way to really a commercial industry in which we can have people perhaps putting, we have an example of that from a gentleman in Nevada right now who's building space systems that they can put up there and inflate, and they've already actually put one up into space, whereas you have a space habitat not done by the government. And it just seems to me that if we're going to be the #1 space power, we've got to have responsible goals in mind. I went to Neil Armstrong's funeral or ceremony yesterday, and of course I'm in the generation that he was the ultimate hero of our generation. And I think he will be the ultimate hero of 1,000 years of human history, quite frankly. But that Apollo program, it appears to me that some people want our entire space program to be based on the structure of Apollo. They want, and we did that for the moon. I don't think we can do that for the entire, and expect to accomplish the great other things that we have to accomplish. We can't do that for Mars at the expense of what it would take and expect to have any other kind of space program. We have some very serious issues that we need to discuss in terms of safety as we move forward, in terms of the way we approach things. I appreciate both of you today giving us a lot of insights as to where we're at and how to proceed. So thank you very much.
I now recognize Mr. Clark from Michigan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is for both of you gentlemen, and it deals with the differences between acquisitions through the FAR and the Space Act agreements. Specifically, in your opinion, how would the outcome of the award and the evaluation of this contract for transportation services be different under the FAR as compared to granting the money through Space Act agreements? How would the outcome of the award and evaluation process be different?
I'll go first and quick and tell you that the panel doesn't have access or knowledge with regard to source selection. So I'm afraid I'm no help with that one, sir.
I would say that the differences at the top level are with the Space Act, NASA loses the ability to direct the contractor exactly how the requirements are done. As Congressman Edwards talked about, we can see what's happening in the design, but we cannot directly influence the design. So we get a lot of insight into what's happening. We can see how they're designing the vehicle. We can see how it's putting together. Admiral Dwyer talked about that, but we cannot give them positive feedback. Is that design good or is that design not good? We can just listen to the design and be there. In a contract, we have the direct ability to interact with the contractor and tell them exactly what we want, the way we want it, to ensure that it meets our requirements. What we're doing with this hybrid approach is we're letting them have this freedom to go ahead and design, but then we're holding it at almost in parallel as fast as I can. In February of 2013, we'll have a contract in place where we can then have them tell us where they want to use alternate standards. They don't want to build it the way we want to. We can provide direct feedback to them under this contract. We're going to ask them how they do hazard reports, how they control the risks associated with spaceflight. We can provide direct feedback to them. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the advantages of a Space Act that allows them to run fast and quick, but then we're in parallel going to put on top of that a mechanism that we can get some ability to interact with them in a more formal manner to actually control the design, that we get something that comes out the other side that we can actually use. So those are kind of the advantages and disadvantages. If you did a pure contract, we would be much more involved, and it would be probably a little bit longer process and a much more costly process if we did just a pure contract.
Congressman Clark, just to shirt tail on Mr. Gerstenmaier's comments, NASA is the keeper of our body of knowledge on how to get systems into space. So to have better and clearer communications, to overcome that problem that Bill just voiced, is the thing that we think would be most important as we go forward in any construct and in any type contract.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back my time.
I now recognize Mr. Bartlett from Maryland for 5 minutes.
Thank you both very much for your testimony and your service. I understand that it's now generally conceded that transportation via this new vehicle could cost several times as much as going on the Soyuz. Is that correct?
We don't believe that that's the case. We've done some kind of worst case analysis, I would say, to go ahead and bound the upper limit of the budget, and that's what you may be referring to, where we have some cost estimates where the seat price is higher than the Soyuz. But then when we look at what we've got in these CCICAP proposals, we look at what we've done under this new method, and we can see various approaches that get us below essentially what we believe the Soyuz seat price is. So I think we've seen both. We'll continue to go work those and see where we are. So we see a range of prices.
Obviously, from a national pride perspective, we'd rather be riding our own horse. Was there any discussion up front as to how much we might be willing to pay in excess cost to make this happen?
We have not had that discussion in terms of excess cost. I would believe that's still in front of us as we bring this design a little bit more to maturity. I think the other piece is it's not just having our own horse, but I talked about it in my oral a little bit, to have another way to get to space station with our crews other than just the Russians is tremendously important. You know, even when we had the Columbia tragedy, we could not have kept crews on board space station. We could have not continued to assemble space station without the Russians being able to back us up with transportation. So no matter how good a transportation system is, for an asset that's as critical as the space station is to get research done and continue to moving forward, we believe we need an alternate way to get to space station, and that's what we're doing with our crews, and that's what we're doing here with this activity, this commercial crew transportation activity.
I understand our goal for this new asset in terms of safety is 1 in 273. Can you tell me what that is for the Soyuz?
We don't have an exact number associated with Soyuz. We've looked at it from a historical standpoint. We don't have the detailed understanding of the systems design and the hardware designs, but we look at it and we would say the Soyuz is equivalent to that, but I can't provide to you a detailed analysis that shows exactly that equivalency. But if you look at the flight history of the vehicle, the amount of time they've flown, I would say that in a more qualitative discussion, you can say they're roughly equivalent.
I really hate to ask this next question because I'm a scientist and a huge supporter of NASA and human spaceflight. If the sequester occurs, it would cut defense about $50 billion next year. Defense is about 1/5 of our spending. So let's be fair and cut everything a commensurate amount. That would mean $250 billion next year. That means we're cutting Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. These cuts are considered draconian and impossible. But if they occur, the full $250 billion, that would be somewhere between only 1/4 and 1/5 of our deficit. Now, if we cannot possibly cut 1/4 to 1/5 of our deficit, how do we ever get there? I have 10 kids and 18 grandkids and 2 great-grandkids. Obviously, it's not going to be business as usual. Obviously, we can't continue doing the same things that we're doing now, and there's going to have to be a line that we draw. Above that, we fund. Below that, we can't fund. How do we determine where we put this program, above or below that line?
I'm not sure I can even answer that question. We could talk about our programs, we can talk about the value of the programs, but then it's ultimately up to this body and a larger body to decide what the right answer is to that question.
Admiral?
I really don't have anything to add to Bill's last comment, sir.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
Chair recognizes Mr. McNerney, gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glad to see you back here this morning again. Mr. Gerstenmaier, let's talk about the commercial crew program for a little while. Now, is the plan, I understand what you've said earlier, that we're not going to completely eliminate looking at the Soyuz as a backup program, but does this eliminate the use of the Soyuz as our main reliable carrier for all of our crews, or are we going to still rely on the Soyuz every so often for transportation?
Our intent would be to use this U.S.-based carrier for all the transportation to and from ISS.
Okay, thank you. That's good. Admiral, do you think that the commercial crew program is receiving more or less scrutiny than oversight in NASA would receive for if there were no private sector involvement? Do you think there's more or less scrutiny now?
The essence of the Space Act construct limits the flow of information and prohibits direction from NASA into the partners. They're not contractors. The partners are the operative word. So I think an honest answer to your question is that there must be less, because this large body of knowledge that NASA holds is more difficult in its transfer to those that are building the future space systems.
That isn't the answer I expected. Does that put a more risk then in terms of safety for our astronauts?
You know, sir, you can build confidence in systems that fly in a couple of ways. The first way I'll mention is difficult, expensive, and long in coming. And that is that you just fly it enough or launch it enough to where statistically you have built the confidence that it's good to go. That's not a launch or 2 or 3 or even 10 But if you launch enough, you can build confidence that it's solid and it's ready to go. And frankly, I think that's part of our confidence in the Soyuz system. On the other end of the continuum, you can have detailed knowledge of the design, detailed insight into the build, and intimate knowledge in the truthfulness of the people. That comes with the intimacy that, in our opinion, is difficult to establish in a Space Act agreement.
Thank you. I appreciated your earlier comment, Admiral, that your biggest gift would be an accurate budget assessment. What do you think the most difficult part of the budget is? Is there a specific item, or is it just too many uncertainties all up and down the chain?
Well, Mr. Gerstenmaier, I think, spoke to it when he said this is a different animal. We know how to do a classic contract, classic full-up, FAR-based government procurement. This isn't one of those for many, and perhaps many good reasons. So it is more difficult, but I don't think is impossible. I will speak with a little more freedom than I did in my DOD days when I was sitting in testimony on the Hill, and tell you that one of the things that I like about a solid cost estimate is it gave me a confident place to stand if it was cogent. They're never right, by the way. They always evolve, but if it gives you a cogent place to stand, then I could be supportive and defensive of the budget that I thought it would take to execute. And then if that budget was cut, other folks wore some of the responsibility for reducing the funding to that program, be it extended schedule, be it increased risk, be it what have you. But others had to wear some of the responsibility. If you don't have a cogent cost estimate, you don't have a place to stand for that conversation.
Thank you for your frank answer, Admiral. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
All right, gentleman yield back. Chair now recognizes Mr. Brooks, the gentleman from Alabama. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Gerstenmaier and Admiral Dyer, thank you for your service. I'd like to get into the finances a little bit more. It's something you all have touched on. And if you could share with me, what is each commercial crew integrated capabilities participant's total private investment, or in a different way of approaching it, the percentage of the government commercial crew award versus the private investment in these programs?
Again, I can't provide the specifics because it's proprietary to the companies, but it's on the order of the probably 80%, 90%, as we've discussed, government investment. It could be a little soft around those numbers, but it's on that order overall. And it varies from partner to partner in the Space Act activity.
Fair to say then that the private sector contribution to the total cost is in the neighborhood of 10 to 20%, the inverse of 80 to 90%. What's your degree of confidence that the private sector is contributing somewhere between 10 and 20%? Not more, not less.
I think we have pretty good insight into what's going on, and we believe that they're contributing on that order. There's no reason to doubt that they're actually contributing those portions that we discussed.
Do you have any data that establishes the amount, perhaps that you can't share with us today because it's proprietary?
I don't have any direct data. You know, you would typically ask me, do I have a 533? Do I have an accounting sheet, a record formally transmitted from them? I do not have that. But we see it from evidence of work they're doing, activities they're doing, and other things. So we indirectly can attest to the numbers that I just talked about.
Thank you. And continuing, Mr. Gerstenmaier, at a rate of no more than 2 NASA missions per year, most analysts conclude that only one provider will ultimately be needed. If only one provider is selected to provide this service, how much government funding will have been provided to the other firms that will not be providing subsequent services to the United States government?
I mean, if you want a precise number, I can take it for the record, and we can go calculate what that number is. But there will be some funds that will have gone to these other providers that are not providing a service. The question is the market going to be just ISS, or is the market going to be bigger than ISS? What we hear from these commercial companies is they believe that there's a market for their spacecraft that's beyond the government's need. They believe there's a commercial sector market for that. So even though one of these companies may only provide services to NASA for our ISS activities, the others may have another market to go do that can be there. Then I have the advantage from a government side is now I have another contractor that I could go back and pick up to go provide services later in some future activity. If we decide to extend, for example, Space Station beyond 2020 and we need some additional services, it may be someone else in the market for us to go buy. So we are investing in that other contractor, as you described, but we potentially get some benefit if they can generate a market on their own.
An underlying premise in the question was that there would only ultimately be one provider needed to do the 2 plus or minus NASA missions a year. Is that an accurate premise?
I believe that's where we're looking for the actual services flight. We're looking at potentially, we say likely, one provider in that region. I think the other reason we want to carry multiple providers earlier is it provides a competition for those across those providers, which keeps them meeting NASA requirements. It keeps them wanting to invest their own funding in this activity, so that avenue of competition up front also gives us some pretty strong benefits to help us get a good price coming out the end, even though we may ultimately down select to just one contractor or one contractor.
In the committee notes for this hearing, it states, quote, on August 3rd, 2012, NASA awarded Space Act agreements to 3 different companies with a combined value of $1.113 billion. Boeing will receive $460 million, SpaceX will receive $440 million, and Sierra Nevada will receive $212 million. Is that consistent with your recollection?
Yes, sir.
And if I do the math correctly, if only one of these 3 companies is ultimately going to be providing services to the United States government, if, for example, that happens to be Boeing, just because they're the ones that are receiving the most money, that means roughly $650 million would have been spent on companies for which NASA is not getting any direct service, but we're spending the money on the hope that someday that competition will lower the cost. Is that a fair assessment?
I would add that the benefit of having competition, the benefit of it's very difficult at this stage in the development to pick a winner. If I knew with certainty which one of those companies could actually come through this process and deliver a product out the other side, I could pick now. But at this point in where we are, I want them to continue their development. I want them to get into test. I want to see how their hardware flies. I want to understand whether they have a safe system or not. And it's that I guess the extra cost you describe, I believe it gives a significant benefit, that it gives me an opportunity to select another provider. If I see one system is safer than another, it gives me an option to move forward. So even though there's an extra cost, I believe there's a significant benefit to us, not monetarily, but from a capability standpoint, from a safety standpoint of carrying multiple providers at this phase.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier, for sharing your insight on why we're doing what we're doing. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the additional minute.
Thank you, sir. All right, recognize did you want to have, all right, we'll recognize Mr. Hultgren of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gerstenmaier, NASA's acquisition plan includes a costly phase, I think it's about $4.5 billion of optional milestones. Wondered, would these optional milestones, if selected, be brought up using, using Space Act agreements or federal acquisition regulations, so SAA or FAR?
They're only available for us to exercise under the Space Act, and we have the ability to exercise them one at a time, so we don't need to pick up the entire phase. We could do those one at a time, but they would be under a Space Act.
Do you know, do the companies expect the optional milestones are part of the certification path?
I think you'd have to ask the companies. I don't anticipate using those in the certification activity. We believe we're going to move to this certification products contract phase 1, followed by a phase 2 as shown in the white paper. We may choose to implement 1 or 2 of those milestones, but we'll be careful about which ones of those we choose, and we'll make sure they're justified and understood and they provide significant value back to the U.S. government.
So your expectation from NASA's point of view is that they wouldn't be used, or if they are used, it'd be very minimal usage, is that right, or select?
I would say selected. We will use those if we selectively see some significant advantage to us to pick up 1 of those milestones or 2 of those milestones in that period.
Admiral Dyer, from your perspective on the safety advisory panel, what are the pitfalls, do you think, of this process?
I don't know that there are any that I haven't mentioned in terms of communications, et cetera, et cetera. It does touch on that what keeps you up at night worry, though, and that is there's tremendous pressure in any government agency and any government program to force fit the job to be done into the money available. So if money does run short, we worry that there may be an attempt to certify, not via a FAR contract, but via the Space Act agreements, perhaps with a very limited demonstration of safety without the insight. That wouldn't be a good thing.
Mr. Gerstenmaier, you mentioned kind of what your thoughts or expectations would be as far as the optional milestones go. Wonder, would they really only become affordable if the Commercial Crew Program is funded at a higher level than it receives today?
I mean, as we project forward, in our budget submit for 2013, we're looking for $829 million or so in fiscal year 14. We think we need those funding levels. It's not clear that a funding level would directly tie to these milestones. In other words, if we had more funding, would we implement these milestones? I would look at it more from a technical benefit standpoint. Does this provide an ability to advance or to get more safety insight? Does this give us an additional test that's critical to us? So it's kind of I don't know, we would look at them and evaluate whether it makes sense. So it's not tied to the overall funding level, whether we would implement those optional milestones or not.
Okay. If I can change direction just a little bit, well, not directly related to today's hearing, wondered, Mr. Gerstenmaier, if you could comment briefly on the current state of the J2X engine.
The J2X is doing extremely well down in Stennis. We've fired that engine for, I believe, up to 19 minutes, which is one of the longest firings we've had in any liquid engine test program. It's meeting all its milestones, all its performance activities. It's proceeding extremely well down at Stennis.
Do you think there's any threat of money being redirected away from J2X development towards some of these other programs?
Again, we need to look at the overall needs of the program of what the right approach is as we move forward for the heavy lift launch vehicle. The upper stage clearly needs this J2X engine if we're going to get in the 130 metric ton region. We can also get in that same lift capability by changing the boosters on the side of this, the SLS. We have an advanced booster contract to go take a look at that to see other liquid systems that may go on the side. So we're actively trading those back and forth. We may slow down the testing a little bit on J2X if we think that gets us to a faster capability for SLS, or we may keep it right at the same path we're on right now. But the intent is I want to take J2X until we have that system fully wrung out and ready to be an operable system for the future.
Okay. Well, I see my time's just about run out. Thank you both. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Ms. Adams, gentlelady from Florida, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gerstenmaier, can you describe the working relationship that NASA has with the CCI-CAP companies and how that relationship helps NASA guide the development of these new vehicles, especially since our biggest concern is that NASA does not have the authority to impose safety requirements at this stage in the development?
We have teams located at each one of the CCI-CAP providers. Those teams get insight into the daily activities and the design that's occurring and the work that's occurring on those designs as they're moving forward.
Are you having open dialogue with CCI CAP?
We have full insight into what they're doing and what activity is going on. We don't have the control side, but we have full insight into what they're doing.
So you don't have a conversation back and forth?
I think that's probably a fair way of saying it.
I want to talk about the cost of Atlas V rockets. The price of an Atlas has skyrocketed under the Evolved Expendable Launch Vehicle program administered under the Air Force. My understanding is that the Commercial Crew program will greatly lower the cost of crew launch for our nation. However, NASA has selected 2 proposals that are using the Atlas V vehicle. Is NASA somehow getting a cheaper price than the Air Force is getting? Did NASA, it paid over $220 million per launch for the Atlas V rocket for the GOES-R and GOES-S missions? Is the cost similar to what we paid under the Commercial Crew program? Or what will be paid under the Commercial Crew?
What we're doing under the Commercial Crew program is we're getting integrated service, which is transportation of crew to the ISS. It's then up to these the Commercial Crew providers to negotiate with United Launch Alliance for the cost of the rockets that you described, for the cost of the Atlas V. That's internal to their contract. What I'm looking for is the total cost on the other side, and it would be best for you to talk to the individual CCI CAP providers to get their insight into what their relationship is with United Launch Alliance.
Okay, do you believe it'll be more cost effective than what the U.S. Air Force is doing?
I don't have insight into that. I know what the seat price is on the other side, or the anticipated seat price, and there needs to be some efficiency there. It does help in the sense that it is helping throughput through the system, and that helps lower some of the marginal costs, which could potentially benefit both sides. It could potentially also lower costs for other satellite providers as well as for us.
If NASA receives level funding on the order of $500 million, $525 million over the next several years for Commercial Crew, does the acquisition plan hold together? Will you get the services agreement sometime in 2017?
As part of our budget submit, we'll go look at some alternate funding scenarios and show you what's available at those various funding levels. But I don't have that information, or I'm not prepared to talk about it today.
So you can't talk about whether you think you will get to a service agreement by some time in 2017.
Well, I think it'd be better for us to take that for the record and then go ahead and actually put the numbers together and then show you where it is as part of our PBE 14 activity.
Okay, and the plan presented today, what would NASA reduce, eliminate, or extend if the program is flat funded?
Say the question again in terms of how...
The plan presented today, in the plan presented today, what would NASA reduce, eliminate, or extend if the program is flat funded?
Again, where we would do is we would go look and see what our options are. If we stay flat funded, we would look at extension. We would look at other alternate activities. And what we need to be cognizant of is what Admiral Dyer talked about. Is if I get a certain funding level, we need to go take a hard look at this and say, is this something we can actually deliver?
Are you not having contingency plans?
We have contingency plans, but not of the level that you just described, because I'm still struggling with exactly what my FY13 budget is. Is it 406, which it was back in 12, or is it the Senate or the House version that sits out in front of us?
And if these awards, we'll go back to the awards, if they were made under the FAR-based selection process, how would the decision process be different?
We followed a pretty rigorous process to do these Funded Space Act awards. It didn't fall under the exact definition of the FAR activity. It has certain constraints, but the spirit and the intent of what we did in our reviews, the way we did our deliberations, the way I set up the teams, the way we did the evaluations, the way we did the criteria is all consistent with what the FAR was, but we didn't follow the exact letter of the law of the FAR.
So it's very close.
It's very close.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. I think we're about out of soap here. We're going to have to quit washing pretty soon. Mr. Gerstenmaier, when I didn't get to have a question, but when as I came back in, you were talking about how the Russians had supported the space station after the Columbia accident, and I guess my question is, how much can we rely on the Russians to supply Soyuz after 2016, even if NASA is no longer a customer there? And as I understand, we're paying them something in excess of $50 million now, and by then it'll be around $62 million.
Again,
when we're no longer buying seats unless we are.
Yeah, we intend, once we get our capability, we would no longer purchase seats from the Russians. We have a problem in July 1st of 2016. We had the Iran, North Korea, Syria Non-Proliferation Act, which prohibits us for providing funding or even bartering for capability from the ISS. We're going to need some relaxation in that act to continue to operate the space station with the Russians. So we are prohibited now from buying seats beyond that July 2016 date with the Russians currently. We anticipate that some legislation will get approved in the next year or so that may help us with that current problem.
Okay. I think that answers the question I had. And Ms. Edwards had a brief question to close on.
Thank you.
Your time's up.
I just adore him. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up on that, in terms of, so you will be seeking a waiver then for INCSNA, and if that's true, do you actually have a legislative proposal? Because presumably that would need to happen at the end of 2012, right? Or 2012 or early next year, right?
We need it in the spring of next year, and we've been working with several folks and we're working internal to the administration to get a proposal to come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Gerstenmaier. It would just be really helpful to have that. I mean, especially if you look at our calendar this year and early next year, it would be helpful if we had something to bounce off of. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your brevity. Now, let's see. The questions are completed. I presume we have no one else. I want to thank the witnesses for their very valuable testimony. And if the committee or any members of the committee who are not here, who have other business here, have questions for you, we'll submit them to you and would really appreciate you being able to answer them to us in writing. They'll be submitted in writing. And we'll keep the record open for 2 weeks for additional comments from other members. And at that time, we thank you again over and over for your testimony and for your time. And you are excused. This hearing is adjourned.